Good evening, friends. My name is Alicia McBride. I am not Bobby Trice, who you may have been expecting as your moderator this evening. Bobby is FCNL's Quaker Outreach Coordinator, but unfortunately he had a last-minute emergency, so he's not able to be with us tonight. So I am stepping in his place. I am FCNL's Director of Quaker Leadership, so I am excited to be with you for this conversation, our January Quaker Changemaker event, setting Quaker lobbying priorities for the 118th Congress. And before we get into that and I introduce our fabulous panelists, I'd like to ask my colleague Emma to share a little bit about how we're going to gather this evening. Emma?
Thanks, Alicia, and hi, friends. As Alicia said, my name is Emma Holbert, and I'm the Program Assistant for Quaker Outreach at FCNL, and I'll be running technology for the event this evening. So I'm just going to go over a few tech considerations before we get started. As a lot of you have been doing, which is amazing, please go ahead and say hello in the chat. You can just share your name, where you're tuning in from, and meeting or church affiliation if you have one. We're so glad that you all are here, and I love seeing the community that we have here in the chat. So continue to introduce yourselves. As you can see, we are recording this evening's speaker portions, but the audience will not be included in the recording for privacy reasons. That being said, feel free to turn off your video if you are at all uncomfortable keeping it on. In addition, captioning is available automatically, as you're probably seeing at the bottom of your Zoom screen. My words are being typed out. If you would not like to see that, you can just click on live transcript on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar and then click hide subtitles, and that should get rid of it on your own personal computer screen. We will have some time for you all to ask questions towards the end of the event. We'll do our best to address as many questions as we have time for, but we will likely not get to all of them. So please, I would just suggest throughout the event, submitting your questions in the chat as they come to you, as you think of them, and I will direct those questions to the panelists. If you're calling in on a phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand if you have a question you would like to ask during the Q&A portion, and we will unmute you so that you can ask your question via the phone. Finally, feel free to contact me if you are in need of any sort of tech support or just support in general throughout this event. You can either private chat me from Zoom's chat bar or email me at eholbert@fcnl.org. All right, that's it. Back to you, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Emma. And it's so wonderful to see so many of you here for this conversation. As we get started, I invite you to join me for about a few minutes of grounding worship, and then we will start our conversation. Well, welcome again, friends. It's appropriate to start a conversation about discerning FCNL's legislative priorities with some worship. I'm really excited to moderate this conversation about one of the things that's really distinctive about FCNL, which is our legislative priorities discernment process, sometimes called the priorities process. Every 2 years, FCNL asks friends around the country to help set the focus of our advocacy work, which really grounds our witness in Quaker discernment and ensures that our witness can be responsive to the concerns of friends' communities in the US. So from now until mid-April, you and your community of friends are invited to participate in this discernment process, which will influence what FCNL advocates for during the next session of Congress, which starts at the beginning of next year. And joining me for this conversation are two friends with extensive experience in participating and working with this process, Dr. Alex Stark and Deb Hale. First, Dr. Alex Stark is the former clerk of FCNL's policy committee in 2018 to 2020. She works as a senior researcher at New America, a think tank in Washington, DC. and she was previously a research fellow at Harvard University's Middle East Initiative and the United States Institute of Peace. She was also an FCNL program assistant from 2010 to 2011. And Deb Hale has been a convinced friend for more than 40 years and has been an active participant in Friends meetings in 4 states. She currently lives in Pennsylvania with her husband, Jim, near her 2 sons and 4 of her 6 grandchildren. She was a social studies teacher in New Jersey and Indiana for 27 years, teaching AP US history, government, comparative religions, and in the International Baccalaureate program. She is a member of Gwynedd Friends Meeting and serves on the Peace and Social Action Committee, the Quaker Life Committee of Gwynedd Friends School, and the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. She represents Philadelphia Yearly Meeting on the General Committee and is a member of the Legislative Policy Collaborative for PYM. And she is also currently clerk of the FCNL Field Committee. So I'm really excited about this conversation about what this process is, how it works, why it matters, and how communities can participate. And I'm also excited to hear your stories about how this process has helped bring friends together. So to get us started, it would be great if you could both explain how the process works in Quaker communities, and once those pieces of input get to FCNL. And what do friends in our audience need to know if they're going to start this discernment in their community? Maybe I'll have Deb start with that.
Okay. Greetings, friends. This is probably my favorite activity at FCNL, so I'm really excited to be a part of this panel tonight. And the reason I like it so much is it's really grassroots democracy in action. I serve currently as the clerk of the Field Committee, and the Field Committee's responsibility is to work with friends around the country through their monthly meetings, friends churches, other Quaker organizations, to help them carry out FCNL agenda in their own location. But it also works the other way. Field Committee is a conduit back to staff at FCNL, where we bring the ideas of friends across the country to our work in DC. Information on this priorities process was sent to every clerk of a monthly meeting or friends church, and as well as it is currently found on the FCNL website, very easy to find. It's on the front page here. So essentially what happens in the priorities process is monthly meetings, friends churches, and groups of Quakers gather to discern the direction and emphasis of FCNL's work for the coming 2 years with the new Congress. Now, there's no one way to do this. The first time I did the priorities process, I lived in Indiana, read about it, and we put an announcement in the morning newsletter for a special meeting on a Sunday evening. And I think 6 or 7 people showed up. We chatted for a while and submitted our responses. So it was that simple. But other meetings, and we'll be talking much more about examples as this panel goes on, have done it in different ways. There have been gatherings over a meal to make it feel much more like a community. The priorities process can take place during adult Quaker education programs. I think one thing that all of the processes have in common, though, is that they take place in a sense of worship. We're looking for spirit-led decision-making on how we should proceed in the coming years. Once this discernment has happened in your meeting, then the difficult part is to limit it down to 7 different priorities. And then these priorities are submitted to FCNL, preferably through the website, but they can also be emailed in. And then the policy committee begins its magic work.
Yeah, well, that's a maybe good transition to pass it to Alex. What does happen once all of those ideas, I think it numbers usually in the thousands of individual suggestions, make their way to FCNL and to the policy committee.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having this. It's great to see all these friends. So yeah, I'll pick up where policy committee comes in. So you've already heard that the process starts in January, but once meetings in churches and groups and sometimes even individuals have discerned, all of that input comes to the policy committee in the spring and the early summer usually. So I just want to say that I'm not currently on policy committee, so I can't speak for them or what their process is, but I was on it for several years and the clerk for several years. So I can tell you what we did. We would usually divide up the input or the kind of responses that we received into each of those 4 we seek categories. And then we would have subcommittees of the committee work to review, go over, discern with all of the input and responses that we receive, and then write a first draft of the priorities related to their we seek. So if you can imagine that if we get 7 suggestions or responses from each meeting in church, and then say we hear from about 140, which is maybe about right, then that means that the policy committee is going to see more like 1,000, maybe more pieces of input or responses. So it's a lot of responses to go through, and it's really helpful for the committee when you discern. If you can add a citation, you'll see that it's all of this in the directions, so don't worry about it now, but adding citations to your responses, to linking them back to the policy statement so that the committee can really sort through your input and kind of get moving on their work. So then in June, the committee usually comes together, maybe by Zoom, someday in person, right? And then we would spend about 3 days really laboring over the first draft of the priorities. So once we had that, we would submit the draft to FCNL staff so that they could review it and give us feedback. And that's not so much to recommend major changes as it is to kind of tweak the language so that it's a little bit more in line with current debates and kind of the ways that we talk about these issues. And also to help us as policy committee to understand what exactly it is that we're asking staff to do once we give them the priorities. So a great example of this is that often if we add more to the priorities, that might require the creation of a new staff position, or it might mean that a staff member has to or will add another issue to their portfolio, or portfolios might move around a little bit. So for example, when I was on policy committee, I remember we at one point ended up pretty significantly expanding the number of priorities that we had around environmental sustainability. And so staff really helped us to discern and to understand how that would mean that those portfolios might be shifted around. And then another year, I think we added, if I recall correctly, we added gun control to the list of priorities where it hadn't been previous to that. And so that became part of a piece of another staff member's kind of existing portfolio. So then once we have the draft and the feedback from staff, policy committee then revises the priorities to reflect that. They often have listening sessions in the late summer or early fall so that members of general committee can call in and ask questions or make suggestions based on the draft of the priorities. And then those priorities go to executive committee for seasoning. And in November, they're presented to general committee at annual meeting for further discernment and for final approval, hopefully. Now, this does not mean that policy committee stops working at annual meeting. The committee usually holds worship sharing groups during annual meeting to do further discernment around the priorities. Often they might revise the priorities document in response to that listening and to discernment on the floor of general committee meetings. In fact, you may have heard stories about the kind of the famous late night meetings that the policy committee often has during the early nights of annual meeting to really labor and just over the discernment, and just an incredible amount of thought and energy and spirit-led energy goes into that work. So I think I just want to leave you with that it's in my experience an incredibly spirit-led and worshipful discernment process, and committee members really try to honor the trust that Quaker churches and meetings have placed in the committee members by doing their own discernment and labor process, really putting their time and energy into it, and then sending their considerations. So policy committee really works hard to give everything that they receive a really careful and deep consideration and spirit-led discernment.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that it is a lot of careful work that goes in throughout the year when it is a priorities year for all of our committees. I just wanted to circle back on a couple things because I know that, you know, this does get a little bit into the weeds of how FCNL works and all of the governance. And I just wanted to note, Alex mentioned the We Seeks as sort of an organizing framework for the priorities. And Emma put a link into the chat where you can see this is sort of a little poem that sort of unifies or sort of a vision statement for the work that FCNL does. And our policy document, the longer document that that summarizes all of the issues that the FCNL community could take a position on, is really organized around the areas identified in the We Seeks. I also just wanted to highlight, Deb mentioned the web link for all of the information about participating, and I think Emma's going to put that in the chat right now. You can find resources, guides, instructions to help your community prepare for their discernment. You can submit the results of your discernment. And I also wanted to let you know that FCNL staff and volunteers can help you if you're doing this for the first time, or you're not sure, or if the person who did this for 25 years doesn't feel up to doing it this year with the technology needs of meeting on Zoom. We are really happy to help, facilitate discernment for you and work with you. So if you email us at quakers@fcnl.org, you can get in touch with someone on our staff about organizing that. But then I want to ask both of you, getting out of the sort of the details of things, to share your perspective on why this process matters and how it has been significant for you personally and for your community. Deb, do you want to start?
Sure. I think the first time that my meeting did the priorities process, I went into it with the attitude that how can my meeting help FCNL do its work? And I think what happens through the process, because it is such a spiritual process, that your meeting itself grows through this, that you decide what is important to your meeting. And even if some of the topics don't make it to the FCNL priorities list, they have made it to the top of your monthly meetings list. And it's something that you may want to work on as well. I think this process matters because it is a bottom-up process. It's not professional staff telling FCNL members across the country what to do, as much as it's people who are living in this country determining what needs to be done, in which parts of the FCNL policy should be prioritized. And finally, I think that this matters a great deal because I've seen these priorities change year to year and Congress to Congress. For example, I think in 2016, the priority about voting rights and the rights of all people to the franchise became a priority because of what was going on in the election. As Alex mentioned earlier, I think that issues around sustainability and seeking an earth restored have definitely grown over the last 6 to 8 years in response to our concerns about climate change. So this process matters not just to FCNL and not just to our work in Congress, it matters to you as a spiritual being and to your monthly meeting as it sets its own agenda.
Great. Alex, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. I think Deb is exactly right that this priorities process really underscores, for me at least, that FCNL is really an organization that's built by and for a grassroots community of Quakers across the country. And so that means that as FCNL supporters or members or whatever, however we like to think of ourselves, we're going to lobby visits and we're calling our members of Congress, we're writing op-eds, doing all of that lobbying stuff. But it also means that we're setting the direction of the organization itself. So, and as you've already heard, this is a really spirit-led agenda, and the priorities process allows for that. So FCNL staff are here, like Deb was saying, it's not so much, churches and meetings helping staff, so much as staff supporting churches and meetings is kind of how I think about it. So FCNL staff are there to help us kind of calibrate on the back end, almost to understand, what are the latest issues and what's going on and what adding different priorities might mean. And then they, of course, also help us to raise our voices in Washington and in our home districts. But ultimately, FCNL staff is there to implement the vision of the Quaker community. And the priorities process is really central to that. That's what makes the whole thing work.
Yeah. And I also, I think as a staff person, I've worked with FCNL for about 17 years. And so I've seen a lot of change in the priorities over time. And I think, something that can be a little, sometimes it can be a little frustrating maybe for a meeting or a church that, says this is my priority. And, even it gets added to the priorities list and, feeling like they're not seeing the movement that they would like or things like that. And I think some of it has to do with, FCNL staff have to build up expertise and connections on an issue. So it does sometimes take, persistence on the part of Quaker communities and then staff to really build the portfolio on an issue. But that doesn't mean you're not being heard about, what the priorities are. I want to ask both of you, about sort of more about the Quaker practice that this, of discernment here. This idea of communal discernment of spiritual leadings is really as old as our tradition. How do you see this process as a part of FCNL's Quaker identity, and how is this different than like another nonprofit that might be just trying to set its agenda with input from their supporters? Alex, why don't you start this time?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, the discernment process is really about speaking truth to power, and it's what allows FCNL to be that prophetic voice on the Hill that's really spirit-led and really forward-looking often. So sometimes that means that FCNL is working on issues that are kind of widely discussed and are notable and that we all know about. But in some cases that really, this priorities process really means that FCNL is that prophetic voice that is leading in Washington, and is maybe even working on an issue long before it becomes a wider priority for Congress. So for me, the work around US support for the war in Yemen is really indicative of that kind of prophetic voice. So when FCNL first started working on that issue, most people, including actually a lot of policymakers themselves, surprisingly, didn't know that the US was even supporting the military intervention, let alone how or what was going on the ground. But by using this voice, including some really, I think, fabulous engagement from the advocacy teams across the country, FCNL and friends, tall F and small f friends, were able to make this into a really important issue, one that, we saw legislation in Congress, we saw, op-eds and stories in newspapers and on TV and all kinds of things about it. It even came up in the presidential primary debates. And the kind of militarization of policing is another issue I think about like that, where FCNL has been thinking about and working on this issue for a long time and trying to kind of lay the groundwork for how does Congress address this. And then within the past couple of years, even it's really risen to national attention, and there are a lot of folks who are really, excited and feeling empowered about what do we do about policing. And FCNL is really leading the way on that because of this kind of spirit-led process.
Deb,
Do you have something to add?
Sure, always. Yeah, no, I would be happy to. Friends historically make decisions in community, and I think that that this process is really no different. When I think about other organizations that I belong to, when a decision needs to be made, what generally happens is a number of different perspectives are brought to the table. You start pulling together your allies, who's going to be on your side. There will be a vote, and majority will rule. And to some extent, power politics are playing out there. So it becomes a competition for direction rather than a cooperative process through which we look for the spirit and we look for ways that the divine wants us to move forward. In the priorities process, there really aren't winners and losers the way there is in other decision-making processes. And I think that that's just really central.
Yeah, and I think that, Alex was talking about the process the policy committee goes through. My understanding is, it's not like they're tallying up how many votes for this or that. It's really, even a small number of really deep connections on an issue can, let something rise up out of that process. So it continues to be this spiritual connection throughout the whole thing. But I also, now I want to turn to, I think we've talked a lot about the process, but I think some of the things that connect people to it are the stories of, people's experiences of doing it in different ways. Deb, you mentioned some of those earlier. And that we don't say, here's the rules, you have to do it this way, or this is what your discernment looks like. So I was wondering if you could each share a story or two about the specific and creative ways your communities have gathered, or that you've heard about communities gathering to do this process. I know, Deb, you have some great stories, so you can get started.
Oh, I've been doing this for a while. I think the process that my monthly meeting, Gwinnett Friends meeting, uses right now works very well for us. What we do is we begin with asking individuals to discern their own priorities and to help them, when you think about all of the Friends testimonies and all of the things in the FCNL We Seek policy book, they're just endless amount of work that we need to do. So how do you decide where to put your energies? So we begin with individuals doing this, and what we created was a series of posters with the We Seeks at the top. So we seek a world free of war and the threat of war. So if one of your policy priorities is to abolish nuclear weapons, that would go under the that We Seek. The next poster would say, we seek a society with equity and justice for all. So if access to the ballot box is very important to you, that equality would matter. We seek an earth restored. If reducing carbon emissions is your is an important priority for you, then it would fit there. What this allows us to do is to gather like-minded priorities and to see them kind of grouped together. So we end up with poster boards with Post-its all over it, looking at similar priorities. And then in a special called meeting, this process goes on for like a month. So people have a lot of time to think, to have their input, to have their priorities, make it onto the list. And then we have a called worship sharing gathering, where those ideas are all put forward, and in a setting of worship, we're able to select our top 7. And it's worked well in that it's a very large number of people that can participate. It's not just who can gather at a certain hour. It allows every voice really to be heard. But my favorite story with this is 2 priorities processes ago, our middle school students in first day school decided that they wanted to do the priorities process themselves. So we had an adult first day school where the worship sharing happened, and then we had the middle school students did it, and they submitted their own list. And interestingly, their list was very different than the adults. And I think not surprisingly, this was in 2018. It was just a month after the Parkland High School shootings. So right at the top of their list was work on gun control. And while that had been on our major list, it didn't make the adult top priorities, but both lists were sent to the policy committee. It just shows that the diversity that we had and input led to a much richer discernment of what our priorities would be.
Alex, do you have some thoughts on sort of ways people have done this that you've seen?
Sure. Yeah, I've seen it done. Also seen it done a lot of different ways. Deb has probably seen even more because of a field committee. But You know, like she said, anywhere from having a potluck dinner or something, a more informal conversation like that, to having a formal business meeting or a worship sharing gathering, that's called. I've also seen a lot of differences, meetings in churches doing it a lot of different ways in terms of the scope of who's involved. So for some meetings, they really might want to engage all of their members throughout the process. And so maybe they do their discernment as part of meeting for business, or in another setting where everyone can be present. For others, it might start with maybe a subgroup of the church or the meeting who are really particularly committed and excited about this. So, for example, if a meeting has like a peace and social concerns committee, they might start the discernment process, and then sort of like at the general committee level, that committee might draft their responses and then bring them to the broader meeting for kind of seasoning. So there's no one right way to do it, or there aren't even a million right ways to do it. I think there are infinity ways. I wanted to second also Deb's point about diversity and inclusion, which I think is so important, from the perspective, of course, of representation, but also, like Deb said, I think the priorities process and engagement is a really useful way to really bring folks and to bring friends in to the life of the church or the meeting. And that bringing in folks with different backgrounds, with different experiences, makes it a more, for me, kind of fulfilling and really interesting and rich experience. So for me, I've learned so much from Quakers and the generations above me about their approach to issues, or what they've done in the past, how things have changed over time. And then, like Deb, from younger generations, they're already way ahead of mine, even though I'm a millennial. So I learned so much from them about like how things have changed, about how young folks think about things, how they talk about the issues, and how that's different, and they're kind of leading the way. So those conversations can really bring together all different kinds of perspectives and can be really enriching for you too, as an individual and as a meeting or church, as well as part of FCNL. I think the most important thing, honestly, is just to not be afraid to get started or to get involved. Sometimes friends are like, I'm not sure how to do this. Am I doing it the right way? But what's going to happen? And I think it's helpful to remember that for every person who's new to the priorities process, there will almost certainly be members of your church or your meeting or your broader community who have done this process for years or even decades and would be really excited and happy to guide you. And like Alicia said, FCNL is also really ready and willing to help you out too. So a lot of this has changed, obviously, in the time of the pandemic. It's difficult for a lot of us to gather. And so maybe you hold your committee meetings on Zoom like we are right now. There are all kinds of interesting online tools that you can use. Like I've seen people use something called a jam board, and everyone can kind of add their little post-its, almost like Deb was describing in real life, but online. So there are just like a bunch of different ways to creatively think about how to engage friends. And FCNL staff and volunteers do such a great job of helping you think through what that looks like. My dog is snoring, in case you hear snoring noises. So I really encourage friends to reach out to FCNL and to ask for help if they need it. And actually, it would be great if you have ideas or ways that you've done the discernment process in the past. If you want to type those in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, that would be really interesting. I think I would learn a lot from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I want to transition now to some questions that have come in on the chat. There's some really great questions that it's so exciting to see so many of you here and engaged in this process, I have to say. Yes, Emma's applauding. As I said at the beginning, like this really is, in my mind, something that's very special about the way that FCNL works with friends across the country. And I'm so glad that all of you are interested in doing this. Alex, I wanted to pick up on the last point you were making about friends gathering virtually, because we had a question from Connie and some others who were interested about suggestions for how best to do this effectively when the meeting is still on Zoom. I mean, obviously, there are some online tools. Not everyone may be comfortable using them if meetings are gathering. For worship on Zoom, you could hold some listening or worship together on Zoom to do this process. But I don't know if either of you have thoughts. And I will say this is an area that if you're struggling with this, please reach out to the Quakers@FCNL.org address, and we'd be happy to talk through some ideas with you. But I was wondering if either of you had thoughts on adapting this process to our situation that we're all in.
Well, I so enjoy doing our Post-it approach the last two priorities process, and it's just not going to work. We have a hybrid meeting right now, but about 2/3 of our members are continuing to meet on Zoom. So we definitely need to adapt. What we've done is asked one member of our Peace and Social Action Committee to gather all of the ideas, so that you email so-and-so and say, I want to abolish nuclear weapons. I want to reduce carbon emissions. And then that person will kind of categorize them and bring them back to the worship sharing session. It's just not ideal, because when we could do it face to face, we would be set up in fellowship hall and these big posters with neon colored Post-its all over it. And it was kind of exciting, and one idea feeds off of another. But this will work. If you have a technologically advanced meeting, I think a Google Doc would work to be able to just continually add to things, and then on a Zoom meeting work that list down. So those are possibilities.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Alex. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, well, I don't have any like super exciting ideas for how to use Zoom, but I know a lot of meetings have been using Zoom just to gather, and while we would love to prefer probably to be in person, it's possible to do the kind of process on Zoom too. And I know that last time around, Christine Ashley had a lot of success engaging meetings, and she would even come and facilitate the process too, I think. I don't want to misspeak. So I think if you'd like to potentially invite someone from FCNL to actually help you to facilitate it, that's also an option.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sure we will learn a lot from all of you as you do this process. What works, what doesn't. I think we're all sort of in a learning mode with adapting. I wanted to ask a question from Jan Phillips from New York Yearly Meeting, which is, New York Yearly Meeting now has a process where friends can be members at large of the yearly meeting, and so they're not necessarily members of a monthly meeting. Do you have thoughts about like how those friends might participate in a process like this?
That's a question for Deb.
Thanks. I mean, I think it would just be so unwieldy for the policy committee to take, hundreds of individual pieces of input. But even those at large memberships that like New York Yearly Meeting has developed, friends still meet in community, and Zoom allows us to put together a community. I don't think it doesn't have to be necessarily under the auspices of the monthly meeting. I know that there are advocacy teams that have submitted priorities. There are Quaker organizations that have submitted priorities. So you don't have to be a bona fide member of a monthly meeting or a Friends Church to do this. But I do think that the community is important. And I would just gather those like-minded people around you, via digitally.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on what Deb said, I mean, I know that, we've had submissions from friends in Quaker retirement communities. And I know Bobby in 2020, helped facilitate a process for the New England Young Friends as well. So it really is less about doing it in a specific kind of community, like a meeting or a church, and more, as Deb said, about the, having people gathered with you in worship and discernment. I want to ask a question from Bill Cousins. This might be more for Alex, but he says priorities can be very general, like address racism, or quite specific. And in your experience, what is the most helpful for the policy committee? This is a challenge he identifies in his meeting of figuring out how to word the priority.
That's a really interesting question. And on some level, I don't want to tell you how to word the priority, because I'd rather, because it is discernment, and our process of gathering responses from you is that we really want to know what you're thinking and how you're being led. So I can just maybe talk about different ways that I've seen it, and then you can think about what works best for you and how you're led. I've seen some groups work with the language from existing, like sort of previous years of the priorities, and from the policy document. So I always call it the blue book, because that helps me remember, because everything starts with a P and it's confusing. But that blue book that kind of has the we seek on the front is the policy document, and that's sort of the much longer version of FCNL's values and what they're working towards. So you can use, if you'd like to, language from previous, there it is, the little blue book. You can use language from previous priorities or from that book too. That can be really helpful guidance. I've seen when some groups, speaking of different ways to do discernment, you can even start with kind of readings from that policy document to sort of think through, to begin your discernment process. Other times it's much more kind of discursive and kind of spiritual language. So whatever really comes up for your through your discernment process, maybe that's a bit longer, and that's okay too. Or maybe in the case if you're using Post-it notes or a Google Jamboard or something like that, it could be maybe just a short phrase, or even stop nuclear proliferation. I don't know, I'm trying to think of really short, end wars. That's totally valid and really valuable too.
Yeah. All right. So here's a question from Barb Hajrati, which is, how do the individually submitted priorities get narrowed down? Like if, Deb, like when you were describing, you had all of these Post-its, like, can you talk a little bit about sort of, maybe how the clerking works or something to help people get to the number that the policy committee is looking for?
Yeah, I hate to sort of sidestep this, but it's sort of the beauty of discernment. I have been in priorities process meetings with just 6 people, and we came up with 7 and we were done. That was pretty easy. I think our last discernment process, we had probably 40 or 50 different ideas. So for me, it's helpful to sort them into sort of types. And sometimes we were able to blend things together. So give me an example. The like working for the access to the ballot is also a part of allowing free and fair elections, right? You know, so that you want to put those two things together, so that it just sort of happens. And I'm not saying that it's an easy process, you know, but that remembering that issues that have risen to a priority in your monthly meeting, even if they don't end up submitted to FCNL, can still become an issue for your monthly meeting to work on. You know, another sort of caveat is that we are the Friends Committee on National Legislation. So, you know, while mask mandates in your children's school may be very, very important issue, they're not the stuff of FCNL work, you know, but that doesn't mean your monthly meeting can't address it. So, I guess allowing yourself enough time for this discernment process to work, to be able to go back into worship, to perhaps table a decision for 2 weeks and come back to it, so that you know, people have had a chance to, you know, to pray on their own. I think those, I've never not submitted 7. It's always worked.
Yeah, and just on that last point, I know, you know, part of why we're talking about this in January, and you've probably heard from us in a number of different ways about this process, is we really want to make sure that your community does have the time. And I know that some communities, you know, organize 2 meetings, where one is they sort of come up with the initial list and then they let it season and then they come back to it to really try to get it sort of down to what they want to send in. So as both of you have said, you know, there's no right way, there's no rules, but we really do want to hear what is on people's hearts and what, you know, what policies need to be addressed and where Friends have a particular voice. I think we could keep going on this, and I appreciate the people who've put comments in the chat and, you know, suggestions and questions, but as I think we need to wrap up pretty soon. So I wanted to give each of you a chance to give, you know, if you had one piece of advice for people who are getting ready to do this process or facilitate it, what would that be? Why don't we start with Deb?
One piece of advice. So maybe I'll do my "and" statement then. I'd say one of the most important things is to diversify your participants, give everyone in your organization a chance to be heard. So it's going to both make your priorities more rich and diverse themselves. So that's good. And be sure to allow enough time for the process. Policy committees asking for these responses to be back the first week in April. You know, so that's a fair amount of time here that we can do it. So set up your initial discernment sooner rather than later, so that if you need additional time, you'll have it.
Great, thank you. Alex, parting words of wisdom.
That's really smart. I think I would just go back to what I said earlier, which is I think one of the biggest kind of walls that comes up for friends is that they don't really know how to get started, or they're nervous about getting involved and feel like maybe they need some kind of expertise or background experience or something like that. And please don't be afraid and don't hesitate to get involved in the discernment process. We love hearing from as many churches and meetings and organizations as possible. And like I said earlier, first of all, there's no right way to do it, so don't worry about that. But second of all, for everyone who's new to the process, there will be other folks who are seasoned or have different ideas for how to clerk the process or lead it. So and with FCNL staff, you're in very safe hands if you reach out for ideas or to have friends come help you facilitate a meeting or a discernment process.
Great, thank you. Thank you to you both for this conversation, and thanks to our audience, all of you, for your questions and your interest in doing this process and wanting to learn some ideas about how to make it work for your community. And I want to now turn things back to Emma for some next steps, reminders, and any last words that we want to leave you with tonight.
Yeah, just quickly before we conclude our discussion for the evening, I wanted to make sure that you all know about a few things. First, I'd like to invite you all to join us next Tuesday, which is February 1st, I believe, for an event called The Persistence of Hope, FCNL in the 117th Congress. And that'll be with FCNL's new General Secretary, very exciting, Bridget Moix, in conversation with Diana Olbaum, the Legislative Director for Foreign Policy, and Amelia Keegan, Legislative Director for Domestic Policy. And I will put that link in the chat so that you can sign up. And then secondly, please save the date for next month's Quaker Changemaker event. It will be on February 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we are really excited that we'll be featuring our migration policy program and grassroots work on immigration. And more information will be coming in your inboxes and on our website soon on that. Well, that's all I have. Thank you so much, friends. And a special thank you to our amazing panelists. This was really incredible. I've been working on this for months and I still learned so much. So yeah, have a great night, everyone, and good luck discerning legislative priorities in your own Quaker communities.
Thank you, friends. Good night.